Good morning and welcome, and thank you for being here as we take this moment this morning to say goodbye to Jim Judd. I'm Rabbi Emily Hyatt. I am honored to be able to spend this time with you. We have a couple of responsibilities and opportunities that we have when we bid farewell to someone this morning. Before we begin, I just want to remind you, please, to make sure that your cell phones are off. And should you need to use the restroom, you're going to go down the long hall back in the foyer, and there are two exits out of this chapel, one under this exit sign, one under this, that will take us directly outside. There's essentially three things that we do at a Jewish funeral. The first thing that we do is prepare ourselves to say goodbye to our loved one through psalms or songs or poetry from our tradition. The second thing that we do is tell the story of a person's life, something that we cannot do until we know how that story actually ends. And in Jim's case, it's a pretty incredible story. It's a long story. And it's full of all kinds of pretty amazing pieces and details. And then the third thing that we do is to say goodbye to Jim's physical presence here with us, knowing that that story actually is the beginning of his legacy, and that we have the opportunity to keep so much of him with us, even as we bid farewell to his physical presence here with us. We're going to begin, just as we start to get ourselves ready for this work of saying goodbye, with one of our Psalms, Psalm 121. And we know that especially when someone has lived in Denver for as long as Jim lived in Denver, that there is so much about them that is rooted here, like it would be in any place, but we attribute some of that rootedness to the mountains, right? Knowing that that's an orientation, and Jim loved to ski, loved to be in those mountains. And so we begin with this psalm. I'll read you the English first. It says, "This is a song for ascents. I turn my eyes to the mountains. From where will my help come? My help comes from Adonai, maker of heaven and earth. God will not let your foot give way, and your guardian will not slumber. See, the guardian of Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. God is your guardian, your protection at your right hand. By day the sun will not strike you, nor the moon by night. God will guard you from all harm, guard your life, guard your going and your coming, now and forever." Psalm 121. Shir lema'alot esa einai el heharim me'ayin yavo Ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai ose shamayim va'aretz. Al yiten lamot raglecha, al yanum shomrecha. Hine lo yanum velo yishan shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomrecha, Adonai tzilcha al yad yeminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka, ve'yareach balayla. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra, yishmor et nafshecha. Adonai yishmor tzeitecha uvoecha, me'ata ve'ad olam. As I was thinking about what other of our psalms or poems really fit today with Jim's story and with who he was, there's this poem by Merritt Malloy, which I really love. And we'll talk more about Jim's life in a minute, but this poem is called "When I Die, Give Me Away." When I die, give what's left of me away to children and old men that wait to die. And if you need to cry, cry for your brother walking the street beside you. And when you need me, put your arms around anyone and give them what you need to give me. I want to leave you something better than words or sounds. So look for me in the people I've known or loved, and if you cannot give me away, at least let me live in your eyes and not in your mind. You can love me best by letting hands touch hands and by letting go of children that need to be free. Remember, love doesn't die. People do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away. And I'll share with you one more psalm before we turn to the story of Jim's life. This is Psalm 23, a psalm that we hear all the time at funerals, regardless actually of what faith tradition we might come from. And there's this really famous line in this particular psalm that we probably know. It says, "As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me." And there are so many words and parts of that line that stick out and that help us to, I don't know, give a little context to this particular moment. One of the things which you probably hear us at Emmanuel talk about all the time is the idea that we sometimes assume that this psalm is talking about a person who has died. As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, perhaps that's where we go when we have passed. And our sages teach us that perhaps it is not about a person who has died, but about those that are left behind. We are the ones that are currently in that valley. It feels low, and we're walking low. And it's a little dark because we are, right, in the shadow of death. But one of the things that we learn about this particular psalm is that there's a really important word in there also, which is through. Rabbi Foster really likes that part, that we walk through the valley. And when I think about Jim, a guy who worked for most of his life, a guy who skied until he was 83, right? I'm guessing that that meant that he didn't spend a whole lot of time in his life sitting, waiting, right? Being sad and not moving, or having a hard moment and just waiting for it to pass. This is a guy who would have absolutely looked for the way through, or just, I don't know, worked through, or skied through, or walked through whatever parts of his story were hard. And so perhaps that lesson and that part of his legacy that we get to take today, that we are a people who move through, that you're a family who moves through. Even in your greatest sadness, we don't stop and stagnate in that sadness. We take it with us, we use it to continue his legacy. Psalm 23. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai ro'i lo echsar, bino deshayar bitzeni, al mei menuchot yanahaleini, nafshi yeshovev yancheni b'magalei tzedek lema'an shemo, gam ki elech begetz al mavet, lo ira ra ki ata imadi, shivtecha umishantecha, hema yanachamuni, Ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged sorarai, dishanta b'shemen roshi kosi revaya. Ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni, kol yamei chayai, v'shavti b'veit Adonai le'orech yamim. Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not want. God makes me lie down in green pastures, leads me beside still waters, and restores my soul. God, you lead me in right paths for the sake of your name, and even as I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You have set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of God forever. And so as we turn now to the story of Jim's life, to thinking about the whole of his time here with us and his contribution to these communities, to this beautiful family, we get to hear a little bit about who he was and what he had to offer, knowing that each of you has your own piece of that story as well. And so I'm going to invite Hannah up to share a few words.
How can we begin to sum up the life of Jim Judd? A life that lasted 98 years. His presence was gigantic in my life. And I know here and now all we can do is our best to remember him and share about him, but we will not come close to summarizing a life well lived. I'm Jim's youngest granddaughter, Hannah. My hope is that each of you will leave feeling you've laid to rest the memory of a great man. Edmond James Judd, E. James Judd, Jim Judd, was born 1,000,000 years ago in Denver. He was the youngest of 3, and I don't know if it was because the youngest or because they named him Edmond, but everyone called him Jim. He actually didn't know his name was Edmond until they were taking roll in kindergarten. So maybe calling Augie and Nora, Chiago and Eleanore every once in a while can't hurt. Grandpa's siblings grew up and moved away, as did his nieces and nephews. But Grandpa remained in Denver, a refuge for anyone who came calling. His childhood and early teens were spent in Park Hill, attending East High School and working at an appliance shop on Colfax. As he finished high school, he enlisted in the United States Army to serve in World War II. Luckily, he wasn't shipped out right away. He ended up in charge of his own group of new recruits down in basic training camp in Texas. Some of these new recruits were some big Texas oil field guys, and every night they'd play dice to make some money. One night, Grandpa thought he would join in and put down his bets. The privates were insistent that he could not join. Grandpa never really took no as an answer, demanded to be included. Well, those burly boys picked him up and carried him right out of the barracks, and it turned out they were fixing the dice game and couldn't possibly take his money. When Grandpa did make it to Europe, it was with the 10th Mountain Division. His brother had called in a favor with his ski patrol buddies. Thankfully, Grandpa survived the war, pulling kitchen duty and taking care of mules. When he returned from the war, he made his way up to Central City, where he dabbled in unsuccessful business ventures with his buddy Pascal Quackenbush. Grandpa also helped reopen the Teller House Hotel next to the Opera House as the bar manager, although he was let go after a season because he was too good at keeping an honest book, and the contributing patrons were complaining about their lack of free drinks. Grandpa was honest, but he was also up in Central City playing poker, so who knows. That all changed when he went to a party with his cousin Lorraine. Lorraine had company in town, a nice girl from Kansas City who was being shown around. To all our dismay, we all know it was Eleanor's legs that Grandpa spotted first, and the rest as well, not appropriate for synagogue. After they were married, then came Uncle Joel and a real job and a bigger house. Grandpa's career started in carpentry, but morphed into a whole construction firm. Grandpa knew every corner of Denver, and he built something on pretty much every other street. The flourishing business grew next to his flourishing family, and my mom and Uncle Ken were born. As the next generation transitioned out of the house and Bubby was working on a doctorate in sociology, Grandpa happened upon his next passion. Like his grandfather and his father before him, Grandpa used his engineering skills to support the Jewish community, volunteering to oversee building the original Road of Shalom building, the tennis courts at the J, or even this chapel for Emmanuel. Community was so important to Grandpa. He cared for his Jewish community, but as the menace of urban renewal took hold in the 70s, his greater Denver community started to change so much that the history of our city on the confluence was being lost. Grandpa got together with some like-minded individuals and started Historic Denver. Grandpa started with 9th Street Park on the Auraria campus and moved on to other buildings like the Buckhorn Exchange and the Cable Building, otherwise known as the Old Spaghetti Factory. These buildings weren't easily saved, but some of Grandpa's stubborn nature is probably to thank for their continued existence. And I personally would have hated to be on the receiving end of one of Grandpa's complaints. And Steve, if you're in here, I'd like to apologize about the tree debacle last year, or a few years back. You might think, with what you've heard about Grandpa, he would have been upset at the more recent changes in the city, seeing buildings he built brought down to become something else. So I asked him if the changes in the city felt like losing his legacy. His response was his legacy was us. Joel, Nancy, Ken, Wendy, Rachel, Lily, and me. He was really proud of us. And that's all who existed at the time of the conversation. I was shocked. For a man who couldn't shut up about his stories, his legacy was us. I guess I was too close. What felt like my normal life was the legacy Grandpa was leaving behind. A family close in distance and in love, a family that is solid and so generous. We were the mark Bubby and Grandpa were leaving on Denver. Through his steadfast skill, his shrewd business acumen, his support of family friends far and wide, we saw and learned to be who we are today. We saw Grandpa take great care of his friend, his sister, and finally his wife, being the person nobody thought he could be. We learned the importance of community, the strength of honesty and care, the pursuit of fun and pleasure. I mean, he skied into his 80s. As long as we, and you guys too, continue to live in those values, Grandpa can never be lost. Our head of the table may be empty, but our hearts are so full. As we were about 5 years out from those crazy COVID times when we lost Bubby and couldn't have been more alone, please give a squeeze and a peck to someone nearby for the memory of Eleanore as well. This next generation of Augie, Nora, and Nomi brought Grandpa so much joy. As he retired from his final job as Bubby's caretaker, Augie joined us on this earth. I think the only thing that made Grandpa smile more than a fresh powder ski day was one of his great-grandchildren bouncing on his knee. I want to thank you all for coming today to help us share in the story of Jim Judd. After 98 years, I'm sure some good stories and some great deeds are going to be left unsaid. He may not have been much for synagogue, but he would have loved to see you all here. As I heard recently, it's a privilege to grieve, for it means you loved and were loved. As we grieve the loss of this man who loved so many so deeply, think about how you can spread his love this year. Thank you.
It's hard to follow that. But one of Grandpa's dear friends also shared a story that he wanted to share with all of you. He couldn't be here today physically because of the distance, but Doug McCain wanted to share that he met Grandpa, or Jim, back in 1980 when shortly after he met Sally, the daughter of one of my grandfather's best friends, Jack Arrant. Jim was a mentor, an employer, but most of all, a dear friend. One of my best stories of Jim was when he had an empty office in his building on 9th and Sherman that he was having a hard time renting. He told me that he would give the first month's rent to the synagogue. The next month, he rented the space. I have never forgotten that lesson of generosity. He taught me more lessons than I can remember. He says, Sally and I will have huge holes in our hearts forever.
Thank you. There is a story or a sort of a poem anecdote that I use all the time at funerals because I think it's so beautiful, and I'm going to share it with you. It's the first time that I've ever used it genuinely and not as a metaphor. So you'll understand in a second. There's a story that's told about the people of Rome who spoke of the great artist Michelangelo as a man who had 4 souls because he excelled in architecture, sculpture, in painting, and in poetry. And it was his skill and his vision that had produced so many of the city's beautiful buildings and statues. And at the end of his life, when Michelangelo was on his deathbed, his friends gathered at his bedside, and they were torn apart at the idea of a world without him. And one friend, so deep in their grief and fear, cried out, "Michelangelo, how will Rome ever get along without you?" And with a weak wave of his hand toward the open window next to his bed and the city beyond, a city that was filled with his creations, Michelangelo answered, "Rome will never be without me." Denver will certainly never be without Jim. But also, just like you said, Hannah, so beautifully, I love that that was his answer, because your family will so never be without Jim. Without that legacy that he built, both physically and within each of you, and the impact that he made on so many of us. His physical contributions to our city, to this community, to this building, and to the lives that many of you lead. And like Michelangelo's four souls represent his influence in so many parts of Rome, Jim too had many gifts and strengths that leave us a powerful legacy. I think he taught us a lot about hard work. I would say he had a whole soul dedicated to hard work. He taught us a lot about community. He taught us a lot about family. But the soul that I want to lift up this morning, that I just couldn't stop thinking about as you shared so many stories with me, was that he taught us about balance. And I don't know that that's a word that you would have ascribed to him, because I don't think it's balance in the traditional sense. But in every story that you told me about Jim and his life, there was a story that was a counterbalance. I'll give you an example. When you talk to me about Jim and Judaism as a whole, the first story that you told me is that he would get dropped off at religious school at Temple Emmanuel on Pearl Street, and then he would immediately sneak out of the building with his friends and go hang out on Colfax, which was not far, and he would come back in time to get picked up. And he at some point had to have a whole conversation with the rabbi in order to actually get confirmed and be included in the confirmation class. And what you told me is that Jim didn't love Judaism religiously or independently of Ellie's love for Judaism, but he did deeply care about communal participation, about what he was building for his family and for his community. And it wasn't just about the building itself or about the community itself. You talked about his commitment to the Passover Seder and how he would sit and figure out what was going to be in the Seder and go through the Haggadah every year so carefully. A holiday that we celebrate at home that tells the story of building community, that first real community and family. And so he gave of himself to build his Jewish community, certainly his construction knowledge. This chapel, Road of Shalom, many of the parts of the JCC or the allied buildings that you talked about, that those were pieces of how he gave of himself to create a foundation. And it was a balance. It wasn't about God. It wasn't about religiosity or about prayer, but it was about a love of Judaism. And I also think that there is such balance to be seen in how he understood responsibility in general. The stories that I heard about his return from the war and his service in the 10th Mountain Division, but then he immediately, as you talked about, embarked on some questionable ventures. Delivered ice, he outfitted wilderness goers, he spent a lot of time in Central City. And then when he met Eleanore, he got serious and he understood what responsibility meant. And he finished his degree in construction management, an engineering degree in construction management at DU, not just because he wanted to, but because he knew that that was what it was going to mean to be responsible for his family. And he worked really hard to be able to do that. So much so that as he got his company started, he began not just to build buildings and to create these really important parts of Denver, but he also began to build family homes. Some of them Ellie liked better than others, but he built those family homes for them to begin their life in and to bring their children home to. And so he also balanced work and family. One of the stories that you guys told me, which I thought was such an interesting way to think about him, is that now we walk around, and I don't know that it's a good thing or a bad thing, but we walk around with cell phones attached to us. And so when we need to make a work call, we do it, regardless of what time it is. And the stories that I heard about Jim are that, especially in construction, everybody was out at job sites all day and nobody had any way to reach each other. And so they would come home at the end of the day, and dinner was actually waiting for Jim when he got home. Allie wouldn't let anybody eat until Jim got home and then had a drink and read the paper, and then they would eat. And sometimes they were really hungry. But the other thing that would happen in the evening is that that's when all of the plumbers and the electricians and the other contractors would also get home, and then they could talk to each other. There was no way to reach each other during the day. And so they would call at night, and it would interrupt dinner, and they would have to, get up and answer the phone. But the other piece of that is that when Jim was he would get home and it would be family time, and then he would get on the phone, and he never cursed at home. But that's not the case for when he was talking on the phone to the contractors and talking to them about when things needed to get done or how that needed to look. And so he really was holding both parts of himself, the one that was in charge of a job site and the construction of a building, and the one that was having family dinner. And he held them both at the same time. And so they moved from house to house. First, the one that looked a little bit like a barn. Because it was the only way to make it feel tall enough to fit in the neighborhood. I think you said it was on Ash Street in Park Hill. And then they moved to, in 1965, he built a house on Exposition right near GW. And because Eleanore wanted him to, it looked really different. And because Eleanore wanted it, he got Leon the architect to design the outside. But also there were all these other pieces of how that house and what it looked like and what it contained evolved that represented that balance. I didn't hear that much about the building of the house. I heard a lot more about the building of the basketball court outside because the kids wanted to play basketball. And so first he built this sidewalk overhang basketball hoop so they could play, but then it got knocked over by a trash truck because it had to sort of hang over into the cul-de-sac. And so then he built a new one that was retractable. And so it's that balance of using those skills not just to build the homes, but also to build for the people who lived in it. And then he built them an ice skating rink and really created this space for his kids. And then they moved to the Polo Club, which was a move that was supposed to be a downsize, but it wasn't a downsize. It was just a change in location. And there were a couple of pieces of that puzzle that were really important. Part of the need to not downsize was because they were the Denver anchor. All the family that moved away had a place to be. And there was a place to gather for Shabbat and for holidays when everybody was together. And Jim and Eleanore were never going to have a house that wasn't big enough for that, to be where everybody came. And that is also the balance. And the story of Jim is that Ellie never wanted for anything. The kids didn't want for things. The grandchildren certainly never wanted for anything. They had so much love. They had a house to spend a sick day at. They had people to teach them how to do anything that they wanted to learn how to do. Jim and Ellie had memberships everywhere and would take their grandchildren anywhere. There was always a place to gather for special occasions, for Shabbat, for holidays. And the way that it felt to sit around a table with Jim, to be there with his whole family, you knew that he was feeling such a feeling of love and pride, even if he got up early before dinner was over to do the dishes because he couldn't hear, or to eat dessert because he was ready for dessert, even if nobody else was ready for dessert. But I'll tell you, I think that the biggest piece of the balance, and what really made me think about it from the beginning, is the way he cared for Eleanore. Their whole lives, truly, when he went back to school so that he knew that he could provide for her, but also toward the end of her life when she started to get sick. You guys described that his last important job, I said, when did he stop working? And you said, when Ellie got sick. That his last job and his most important job was taking care of her. And his last job ended when she died, because that was what he did all the time, full time for the last 10 years of her life. He continued to make sure that she did not want for anything. And it was his job. And he wouldn't let anybody else do it. And the stories that you told me of the last weeks of her life, when she was in a rehab facility, but it was also COVID, and the things that he did to be near her and to take care of her. He moved from an independent living facility to a different one so that he could be near her, even though he lived in a shoebox. He would sit in the parking lot outside her window during COVID when people stopped being allowed in. And you said she didn't know who he was, but she knew that he was important for her, that she recognized that he mattered when she would look at him out the window and she would wave at him. And that's his whole life, that he did that. When she wanted to travel, he would say, go. And she would go to these amazing places, and he would instead refurbish an RV and drive around and then sell it. And then they do the whole thing over again. His whole world balanced around her. And it wasn't that his whole world revolved around her, because he had friends and a life and interests and cares of his own, but he made her his balance so that he could be with her and he could take care of her. And so when we started, and I asked you, what are the adjectives that describe Jim? And you said he was an engineer, and he was analytical, and he was exacting and honest and dutiful. And then you said he was generous and caring and spontaneous and loving and doting. And those were the two sides of him. That he was literally so business-oriented, but so caring and giving. And so instead of looking out of a window, though you can probably drive around Denver and see the beauty of his legacy, we also, just like Hannah said, and just like Jim said, get to look out at his family, get to look out at his community, get to look out at what he built and the friends and the family that Jim and Ellie built, and see such strength and such love and such balance. A balance of building and then just appreciating. A balance of creating and then being able to just love in that creation. And so I hope that you find great strength in the enormous pride that I know that Jim felt for what he and you all have built together, for your beautiful family, for the beautiful preservation of what is old, but also for the incredible creation of what is new that comes from what has been before it. And just like Rome is evidence of evidence of Michelangelo's art, I hope that all of your lives are too the evidence of Jim's long life. And for that, we can each be so very grateful. And with that, we turn now to the conclusion of this piece of our service today. In a few moments, we will transition from the, again, balance, right? We will transition from the holding of Jim's legacy and the telling of his story to the departure of his physical self from us. But in the meantime, we rise as we are able, as we say our memorial prayer. El Male Rachamim Shochen Bamromim Hamsei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Hashchina Im Kedoshim Utehorim Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim Et Nishmat Yaakov ben Shmuel ve'Esther Shehalach leolamo Bala Rachamim Yastirehu Beseter Knafav leolamim Veyitzror Bitzror Chaim Et Nishmato Adonai Hu Nachalato Ve'yanuach b'shalom Al Mishkavo Ve'nomar Amen. God of abundant mercy, God most high, may the soul of our loved one who has gone into eternity find the gift of perfect peace in your embrace, together with the holy and pure whose light shines like the radiance of heaven. Compassionate God, hold Edmond James Judd close to you forever, so that his soul may be bound up in the bond of life eternal. May he find a home with you, and may he rest in peace. And together we say, Amen. In just a moment, we will hear some instructions from the folks at Feldman. Before we do that, I want to share with all of you that Shiva will begin, for those of you that are not coming to the cemetery with us, at 1 p.m. or after. And tonight at 5 p.m., there will be a Shiva service. I want to make sure that you know that the location of Shiva has changed because Wendy is still not feeling well. And so Shiva will be held at 10315 East Weaver Circle in Englewood, 80111.
Ladies and gentlemen, that information is in the handouts, the correct Shiva information. We were able to change it in time for that. So this does conclude our service here at Temple Emmanuel. Interment is at Emmanuel Cemetery. If you'd like to join us for interment, we'll ask you to start making your way to the cemetery as quickly as possible. We do not have an escorted procession, so you are on your own. Just like we will, you need to follow all traffic laws. So you're welcome to follow the hearse, but if you do, remember, if we go through a red light, you can't. We'll ask you to remain in your places as we escort the family and the casket out, and then we'll ask you to return to your cars as quickly as possible. One last request will be, please try not to express your condolences to the family between now and them getting to their cars. It delays their process when we do need to get to the cemetery. I'll invite the pallbearers forward at this time.